The scream came first, sharp and full of fear, echoing across the stone courtyard before anyone could react. A young trainer stumbled backward, clutching his torn sleeve, his face pale with shock. Behind him, 2 wolf cubs crouched low, their eyes wild, their small bodies trembling with a mix of fury and terror. This was the 3rd handler that week to be driven off, and the entire castle held its breath, waiting to see what King Ronan Voss would do next. Ronan stood at the edge of the courtyard, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was a man built by war, his shoulders broad from years of carrying a kingdom on his back, his eyes carrying a weight that never seemed to lift. His sons, Kale and Roran, were barely past their 1st year, yet they already carried the same fire that had made their father a legend on the battlefield. The problem was that fire refused to be tamed, refused to be dressed in the very armor meant to keep them alive. "Get him to the healer," Ronan said, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered beneath every word. 2 guards rushed forward to help the injured trainer, while the rest of the courtyard watched in silence. No one dared approach the cubs now. They had backed into a corner near the stable wall, snarling at anyone who came within 10 feet of them. Ronan's advisor, an older wolf named Bastian, approached carefully, keeping his eyes low in a show of respect. "My king, this is the 5th attempt this month. The blacksmith refuses to make another set of armor, unless someone can hold the boys still long enough to fit it." "They are frightened," Ronan said, his eyes never leaving his sons. "Not disobedient, there is a difference." "Frightened or not, my king, they cannot enter the War Council presentation unarmored. The other packs will see it as weakness, as a failure of the royal bloodline." Ronan's fists tightened at his sides, though his face remained unreadable. He had fought 100 battles without flinching, yet the sight of his own children trembling in fear struck something deeper than any blade ever could. He remembered his own childhood, the harsh training, the armor forced onto his back before he even understood what war meant. He had sworn he would raise his sons differently, yet here he was, watching them suffer under the same old methods, the same old expectations. "Find someone new," Ronan said finally. "Someone who does not see them as beasts to be conquered." Bastian frowned, clearly skeptical. "My king, we have tried the best trainers in the kingdom. What kind of person could possibly succeed where seasoned warriors have failed?" Ronan did not answer. He simply turned and walked back toward the castle, his cloak snapping behind him in the cold morning wind. Behind him, the cubs continued to growl, their small chests heaving, their eyes locked on every guard who dared step too close. Inside the castle kitchens, far from the tension of the courtyard, a young Omega named Elandra scrubbed pots with quiet focus, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her dark hair tied back in a simple knot. She had arrived at Blackfang Castle only 3 days earlier, carrying nothing but a small bag and a letter of recommendation from a border village that had long since been destroyed by war. She spoke little, kept her head down, and worked harder than anyone else in the kitchen, grateful simply to have a roof over her head and food in her stomach. The other kitchen staff whispered about her when she was not looking, curious about the quiet Omega with the guarded eyes and careful hands. They noticed the way she flinched at loud noises, the way her gaze sometimes drifted far away, as if she were remembering something none of them could see, but no one asked. In a castle built on war, everyone carried scars, and everyone understood the unspoken rule of leaving old wounds alone. Elandra had grown up near the eastern border, in a village that sat directly in the path of the endless conflict between Blackfang and its rival kingdoms. She had lost her parents when she was young, raised instead by a pack of surviving elders who taught her how to endure, how to stay calm when the world around her burned. She had seen frightened animals before, had learned patience with wounded creatures, long before she ever set foot in a royal kitchen. It was a skill she never expected to need again, not here, not in a place surrounded by stone walls and armed guards. That afternoon, as she carried a basket of bread across the courtyard toward the servants' quarters, she heard the growling before she saw the cubs. She paused at the edge of the open yard, watching as 3 guards attempted, once again, to approach the small wolves crouched near the stable wall. The cubs snapped and snarled, backing further into the corner, their fear radiating outward like a physical force. Something in Elandra's chest tightened at the sight. She recognized that fear immediately, the wide eyes, the flattened ears, the desperate need to protect oneself from a world that felt too large and too dangerous. She had felt that same fear once, hiding in the rubble of her village as soldiers marched past, praying they would not notice her. Without thinking, she set her basket down near the kitchen entrance and walked toward the courtyard. One of the guards noticed her first and raised a hand in warning. "Stay back, Omega. These are the king's sons. They are dangerous right now." Alondra did not stop. She lowered herself slowly to the ground, several feet away from the cubs, careful to keep her body language small and unthreatening. She did not look directly into their eyes, understanding instinctively that direct eye contact would only heighten their fear. Instead, she kept her gaze low, her hands open and visible, her breathing slow and steady. The guards exchanged uncertain glances but did not stop her, partly out of curiosity and partly because none of them wanted to get close enough to the cubs to intervene. Alondra sat quietly on the cold stone ground, humming softly under her breath, an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing during the worst nights of the war, when explosions lit up the sky, and fear was the only companion she had. Slowly, the growling from the cubs began to soften. Kale, the slightly larger of the two, tilted his head, his ears twitching as he listened to the unfamiliar melody. Roran remained more cautious, pressed tightly against his brother, but his trembling seemed to ease just slightly. Alondra did not move closer. She simply continued humming, letting the cubs decide for themselves whether to trust her presence. Minutes passed, feeling much longer to the guards who watched in stunned silence. Then, slowly, Kale took one small step forward, then another, until he was close enough to sniff at the air near Alondra's outstretched hand. She did not flinch, she did not reach for him. She simply let him approach on his own terms, exactly as she would have done with any frightened creature in her village long ago. Kale sniffed her fingers cautiously, his small body still tense, but the wild fear in his eyes had softened into something closer to curiosity. One of the guards let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "I have never seen them calm like this," he whispered to his companion. Alondra remained still, allowing Kale to explore at his own pace, while Roran watched from a safe distance, his ears no longer pinned back in distress. For the first time since the trainers had begun their failed attempts, the courtyard fell into a strange, peaceful quiet. Word of the incident spread through the castle faster than any royal announcement. By evening, servants in the kitchen were whispering about the new Omega girl who had calmed the king's sons without force, without command, without even trying to touch them. Some dismissed it as luck. Others wondered if there was something more to it, some hidden skill she had not revealed. Alondra herself said nothing about the encounter, returning to her duties in the kitchen, as though nothing unusual had happened. She scrubbed pots, chopped vegetables, and kept her head down, unaware that her quiet moment in the courtyard had already reached the ears of the one person in the castle who held the power to change her life entirely. That night, as she lay on her small cot in the servants' quarters, Alondra stared up at the wooden ceiling, her mind drifting back to the trembling cubs in the courtyard. She thought of her own childhood fear, the nights spent hiding from soldiers, the comfort of a familiar voice singing softly in the dark. She had not planned to help the cubs. She had simply reacted, drawn by an instinct she could not fully explain. She did not yet know that Alpha King Ronan Voss had already heard every detail of what happened in his courtyard that afternoon, or that he would soon summon her directly into his war room, determined to understand how a simple kitchen maid had succeeded where his most skilled trainers had failed. She did not know that her quiet moment of kindness had just set into motion a chain of events that would change not only the fate of two frightened wolf cubs, but her own place within the walls of Blackfang Castle forever. For now, she simply closed her eyes, humming the same old lullaby under her breath, unaware that somewhere across the castle, a king was already asking questions about the girl who had made his sons feel safe for the very first time. The next morning arrived cold and gray, mist curling low over the castle walls as the kitchen staff began their early routines. Alondra rose before dawn, as she always did, moving quietly through the narrow halls toward the kitchen. She expected nothing unusual, expected only another long day of scrubbing and chopping and staying unseen. Instead, she found Bastian waiting near the kitchen entrance, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are the one who approached the king's sons yesterday," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Alondra's stomach tightened, unsure if she was in trouble. "I did not mean to interfere, sir. I only wanted to help." "The king wishes to see you," Bastian said simply. "Now." Alondra's heart pounded as she followed him through the castle corridors, her simple kitchen clothes feeling suddenly out of place against the grand stone walls and tall windows. She had never been summoned by royalty before, had never expected to find herself walking toward the war room, where the fate of kingdoms was decided. As they approached the heavy wooden doors, Elandra took a slow breath, steadying herself the same way she had steadied the frightened cubs the day before. Whatever waited on the other side of those doors, she told herself, she would face it with the same quiet calm that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life so far. Bastian pushed the doors open, revealing the war room beyond, its walls lined with old maps and weapons from countless past battles. And there, standing at the head of a long table, was Alpha King Ronan Voss himself, his sharp eyes turning toward her the moment she stepped inside. Ronan studied her for a long moment, saying nothing at first. Elandra kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for whatever judgment he intended to pass. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled only by the crackle of a distant fireplace, and the faint sound of wind pressing against the tall windows. "Look at me," Ronan finally said. Elandra lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time. She expected anger, or at least suspicion, yet what she found instead was something closer to exhaustion. The weight of a man carrying burdens far heavier than his broad shoulders suggested. "Tell me what you did yesterday," Ronan said, "and do not lie to me. I have heard 3 different versions of the story already, and none of them agree." "I did not do anything special, my king," Elandra said carefully. "I simply sat near them. I did not try to touch them or force them. I only wanted them to feel less afraid. My finest trainers could not get within 10 feet of my sons without being bitten," Ronan said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Yet you sat beside them within minutes, and they allowed it." Elandra hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about the king's tired eyes made her decide honesty was the safer path. "Fear does not respond well to force, my king. I have seen frightened creatures before, in my village, before it was destroyed. The more you push them, the more they resist. But if you let them choose to come closer, on their own terms, they often will." Bastian, standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably, clearly skeptical of such a simple explanation, succeeding where trained professionals had failed. Ronan, however, studied Elandra with a new kind of focus, as though seeing her for the first time, not as a servant, but as someone who understood something he himself had forgotten. "My sons must be armored before the War Council presentation," Ronan said. "It is tradition. Every heir to this kingdom is expected to stand before the council in full armor, as proof of their readiness. If they cannot be armored, the other packs will see it as weakness, and weakness invites challenge." "I understand, my king," Elandra said. "Then you will try," Ronan said, his tone leaving no room for argument, though it was not quite a command either. "You will work with my sons, until they can wear their armor without fear. If you succeed, you will be rewarded. If you fail, you will return to the kitchens, and we will find another way." Elandra bowed her head slightly. "I will do my best, my king." Ronan studied her a moment longer, something flickering behind his eyes that he did not name, before turning back to the maps spread across his table, signaling that the conversation had ended. Bastian escorted Elandra out of the war room, his expression still uncertain, though a small part of him allowed himself to hope that perhaps, against all odds, this quiet Omega girl might actually succeed. That afternoon, Elandra returned to the courtyard where Kale and Roran had been kept under careful watch, away from the rest of the castle grounds. The cubs still bore signs of stress, their fur slightly matted, their eyes wary of every guard who passed nearby. When Elandra approached, however, something shifted in their posture, a flicker of recognition from the day before. She lowered herself to the ground again, several feet away, and began humming the same soft lullaby. This time, Kale approached almost immediately, his earlier caution replaced by curious interest. Roran remained more hesitant, watching from behind his brother, but his ears no longer pinned back in fear. Elandra spent the rest of the day simply sitting with them, letting them grow accustomed to her presence without asking anything in return. She did not bring armor. She did not attempt to touch them beyond allowing Kale to sniff her outstretched hand. She understood that trust could not be rushed, that pushing too quickly would undo whatever progress had already been made. As the sun began to set, painting the courtyard in soft orange light, she noticed Ronan watching from a distance, half hidden behind a stone archway. He said nothing, simply observed, his expression unreadable, as he watched his sons slowly relax in the presence of a girl who commanded no fear, no force, only patience. Over the following days, Elandra returned each morning and evening, slowly building a routine with the cubs. She brought small pieces of cloth carrying her scent, allowing them to grow familiar with her presence, even when she was not physically there. She told them quiet stories in a soft voice, tales of her village before the war, of small kindnesses that had helped her survive the darkest days of her childhood. The castle staff began to notice the change. Guards who once dreaded approaching the cubs now saw them resting calmly near the stable wall whenever Elandra was nearby. Whispers spread through the servants' quarters, some admiring, some suspicious, wondering how a simple maid had accomplished what seasoned trainers could not. Bastian, still skeptical but increasingly curious, began observing Elandra's methods more closely, taking note of her patience, her refusal to force anything, her quiet understanding of fear in all its forms. He reported his observations to Ronan each evening, watching as the king's expression shifted from doubt to something closer to reluctant respect. Meanwhile, Elandra remained unaware of just how closely she was being watched, focused only on the small victories she achieved each day. She noticed the way Roran's trembling had begun to ease, the way Kale now approached her without hesitation, his small tail occasionally giving a hopeful wag. These small changes felt like enormous victories to her, proof that patience and understanding could accomplish what force never could. One evening, as she sat quietly with the cubs near the stable wall, she noticed a shadow approaching from across the courtyard. She looked up to find Ronan himself standing several feet away, his expression softer than she had seen before, though still guarded by years of hardened leadership. "They trust you," Ronan said, his voice quiet in the evening air. "They are learning to," Elandra replied. "Trust takes time, my king. It cannot be forced." Ronan nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward his sons, who now rested peacefully beside Elandra, their earlier fear replaced by calm familiarity. "I have tried everything to protect them," he said, almost to himself. "Yet it seems the answer was something I overlooked entirely." Elandra said nothing, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected moment of vulnerability, from a king known throughout the land for his strength and unyielding resolve. Ronan seemed to catch himself, straightening his posture as though remembering his position, before turning to walk away without another word. Elandra watched him go, her heart carrying a strange mixture of confusion and quiet understanding. She recognized something in his eyes, a burden similar to her own, carried silently beneath layers of duty and expectation. She did not yet know how deeply that recognition would shape the days to come, or how her quiet presence in the courtyard was slowly becoming something far more significant than anyone in the castle had anticipated. For now, she simply continued her work, one small step at a time, unaware that the entire kingdom's attention had begun to turn toward the quiet Omega Maid, who had succeeded where warriors and trainers alike had failed. Days passed, and the bond between Elandra and the two cubs grew steadier with each visit. What once required careful distance and quiet patience now allowed her to sit close enough for Roran to rest his small head against her knee, his earlier fear replaced by a comfort that surprised even the guards who watched from the courtyard edges. Kale had grown bold enough to nudge at her sleeve whenever she paused too long between stories, impatient for her attention in the way only a young cub could be. Elandra began introducing small pieces of leather into their playtime, not as armor, but simply as objects to explore. She let the cubs sniff the material, paw at it, chew gently on its edges, allowing them to associate the strange texture with safety rather than danger. She never rushed the process, understanding that any sign of force would undo weeks of careful trust. One morning, as golden light spilled across the courtyard stones, Elandra sat with a small leather vambrace resting in her lap. Roran eyed it curiously, sniffing at the unfamiliar object without the wild panic that had defined his earlier encounters with armor. Elandra did not reach for his leg immediately. Instead, she let him approach the vambrace on his own, nosing it, pawing at it, growing familiar with its shape and smell. After several long minutes, she gently lifted the vambrace and held it near his foreleg, watching closely for any sign of distress. Roran's body tensed slightly, his ears flattening for just a moment, but he did not pull away. Elandra spoke softly, her voice calm and steady, praising him gently. as she carefully fastened the leather around his small leg. The courtyard fell silent. Guards who had witnessed countless failed attempts before now watched in stunned disbelief as Roran remained still, allowing the armor to rest against his skin without a single growl or attempt to bite. Kale, sensing his brother's calm, pressed close beside him, watching curiously, as though considering whether he too might allow the same. Elandra kept her movements slow and deliberate, finishing the fitting before gently releasing her hold, giving Roran the freedom to shake it off if he chose. He did not. Instead, he sniffed at the armor curiously, testing its weight, before settling back down beside his brother, seemingly satisfied that the strange object posed no threat. Word of the small victory spread through the castle before the sun had even reached its highest point. Servants whispered excitedly in the kitchens, guards exchanged astonished glances in the barracks, and even the blacksmith, who had long given up hope of ever completing his commission, expressed cautious optimism upon hearing the news. Bastian arrived at the courtyard within the hour, his expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration, as he observed Roran resting calmly, the leather vambrace still fastened securely around his leg. "I would not have believed it," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not even if I had seen it with my own eyes, which I suppose I have." Elandra offered a small, humble smile, though she remained cautious about celebrating too soon. "It is only one piece, Bastian. There is still much work ahead before they can wear full armor." "Still," Bastian said, shaking his head slowly, "this is more progress than the castle has seen in months. The king will want to know immediately." That evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains surrounding Blackfang, Ronan arrived at the courtyard himself, drawn by the news that had reached his war room. He stood near the archway, watching quietly as Elandra sat beside his sons, the leather vambrace still resting comfortably on Roran's leg. He did not announce his presence immediately, choosing instead to observe from a distance, studying the scene with an intensity that surprised even himself. He watched his son, once wild with fear, now resting peacefully beside a girl who had asked for nothing but patience in return. He watched Kale nudge playfully at Elandra's hand, his earlier ferocity replaced by an almost childlike curiosity. Something shifted within Ronan as he watched the scene unfold, a quiet ache settling in his chest that he could not quite name. He thought of his own childhood, the harsh lessons forced upon him long before he was ready, the armor pressed onto his back with commands rather than kindness. He had sworn to raise his sons differently, yet somehow, without realizing it, he had allowed the same old fears and expectations to guide his approach. Elandra noticed his presence eventually, glancing up to find him watching from the archway. She offered a respectful nod, unsure whether to continue or wait for his instruction. Ronan simply raised a hand, gesturing for her to carry on, content for now to observe silently from a distance. As twilight settled over the courtyard, Ronan finally approached, his footsteps deliberate against the stone ground. Roran, sensing the presence of his father, lifted his head slightly, though he did not shy away as he might have in the past. Kale, ever bold, trotted forward eagerly, sniffing curiously at Ronan's boots. "He wears it well," Ronan said quietly, his eyes fixed on the small leather vambrace still secured around his son's leg. "He earned it in his own time, my king," Elandra replied, "not because anyone forced him, but because he chose to trust." Ronan knelt slowly, lowering himself to eye level with his sons, something he rarely allowed himself the time to do, amid the endless demands of ruling a kingdom at war. Roran approached cautiously, sniffing at his father's hand before allowing a gentle nuzzle, a small gesture that carried enormous weight in the quiet stillness of the courtyard. For a long moment, no one spoke. Guards watched from a respectful distance, servants peered curiously from castle windows, and Elandra remained quietly at the edge of the scene, watching the fierce Alpha King soften, if only briefly, in the presence of his sons. "This is only the beginning," Elandra said gently, breaking the silence. "There is still the second vambrace, the chest plate, and the helm. Each piece will require the same patience." Ronan rose slowly, his expression returning to its usual composed strength, though something in his eyes remained softer than before. "Then we will need more time," he said, "and more of whatever it is you have been doing." "I will do everything I can, my king," Elandra said. Ronan studied her for a long moment, an unspoken question lingering behind his gaze, though he did not voice it. Instead, he turned to walk back toward the castle, pausing briefly to glance back at his sons resting peacefully beside the quiet Omega Maid, who had somehow, against all expectations, begun to change everything within the walls of Blackfang. As the days continued, Elandra worked steadily toward fitting the second vambrace, following the same careful process that had succeeded before. Kale proved slightly more stubborn than his brother, testing her patience with occasional bursts of hesitation, though he never returned to the wild fear that had defined his earliest days. The castle, once filled with doubt and frustration over the untamable cubs, began to buzz with quiet hope. Servants spoke openly now about the Omega Maid who had accomplished what none of the kingdom's finest trainers could achieve. Even the pack elders, usually quick to dismiss such matters, began to take notice, their curiosity mixed with a growing unease about the sudden rise of a lowly kitchen maid within the royal household. Elandra remained unaware of the growing tension building beneath the surface of her small victories, focused only on the steady progress she made each day, with the two cubs who had slowly become far more important to her than she ever expected. She did not yet know that her success, however quiet and humble, had begun to draw attention from corners of the castle, far less welcoming than the courtyard she had come to think of as her own small sanctuary. The pack council chamber sat heavy with tension the following week, its long stone table, surrounded by elders whose faces carried decades of tradition and unwavering expectation. Word of the Omega Maid's success had reached every corner of the castle, and not everyone welcomed the news with the same quiet hope that had spread through the servants' quarters. An elder named Corwin, one of the oldest and most respected voices on the council, rose slowly from his seat, his weathered hands resting against the polished wood of the table. "It has come to our attention," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent shaping the kingdom's traditions, "that a common Omega Maid has been given unsupervised access to the royal heirs." Bastian, seated near the head of the table beside an empty chair reserved for the king, cleared his throat carefully. "The girl has succeeded where trained professionals failed, Elder Corwin. The Prince Roran now wears his vambrace without resistance." "And how?" Corwin pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Does an untitled Omega accomplish what our finest warriors could not?" Such success raises questions. Questions of method, questions of influence. A murmur rippled through the gathered elders, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging uncertain glances. Another elder, a stern woman named Muriel, leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Bastian. "There are old stories," she said carefully, "of Omegas using unnatural charms to bend the will of others. Perhaps this girl has learned such tricks in whatever village she crawled out from." Bastian frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I have observed her methods myself, Elder Muriel. She uses nothing but patience and calm. There is no charm, no trickery, only time and gentle understanding." "Convenient," Corwin muttered. "That patience alone succeeds where strength has failed for months." The chamber doors opened suddenly, drawing every eye toward the entrance, as Ronan strode inside, his presence immediately commanding silence throughout the room. He took his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the tense atmosphere hanging over the gathered elders. "I understand there is concern regarding the maid working with my sons," Ronan said, his voice steady and firm. Corwin straightened in his seat, choosing his words carefully in the presence of his king. "With respect, my king, an Omega of no rank has been granted access to the heirs of Blackfang. Such closeness to the royal bloodline is unprecedented, and unprecedented circumstances invite scrutiny." "The girl has succeeded," Ronan said simply, "where every trained warrior in this kingdom has failed. That alone should invite curiosity, not suspicion." "Curiosity is precisely why we must proceed carefully," Muriel interjected. "Perhaps summon the girl before this council. Allow her to explain her methods directly, so that any doubts may be settled properly." Ronan considered this for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden table. He understood the political weight behind such a request, the need to satisfy tradition and calm the growing unease among the elders, even as his instincts told him the concerns were unfounded. "Very well," he said finally. "Summon her tomorrow morning. Let her answer for herself." The following morning, Elandra found herself standing once again before a room full of powerful figures, though this time, the atmosphere felt far less welcoming than her earlier meeting with the king alone. The pack council chamber loomed large and imposing, its stone walls lined with old banners representing generations of Black Fang leadership. She kept her eyes low, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as Corwin rose to address her directly. "Tell us," he said, his tone carrying a sharp edge of challenge, "how an untitled Omega has succeeded in calming the royal heirs, where seasoned trainers could not." "I have only offered patience, Elder," Elandra said, her voice steady, despite the weight of every gaze fixed upon her. "I did not force them, or command them. I simply allowed them to approach on their own terms, without fear." "Patience alone does not explain such rapid success," Muriel said, leaning forward with sharp scrutiny. "Perhaps there is something more you are not sharing with this council." Elandra felt her heart pound, though she kept her composure, remembering the same steady calm she had used to soothe the frightened cubs. "I grew up in a village along the eastern border, Elder. I learned from a young age how to calm frightened creatures, how to survive fear without adding to it. There is no secret method, only understanding born from experience." "And what experience is that?" Corwin pressed. Elandra hesitated, memories of her destroyed village flashing briefly behind her eyes before she steadied herself once more. "The experience of losing everything to war, Elder, and learning that fear responds better to calm than to force." A heavy silence settled over the chamber, some elders exchanging uncertain glances, clearly moved despite their earlier skepticism. Bastian, seated quietly near the king, offered a small, approving nod, grateful that Elandra had spoken with such honest simplicity. Ronan, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I have witnessed her methods myself. There is no trickery here, only genuine patience and understanding. I trust her judgment, and I trust the results she has already achieved." Corwin, though clearly still uneasy, seemed to recognize the futility of pressing further against the king's direct endorsement. "Very well, my king. We will allow her to continue, though we shall watch her progress closely." "As you should," Ronan said simply. "Results will speak louder than suspicion." The council meeting ended shortly after, though the tension in the chamber lingered long after Elandra had been dismissed. As she walked back toward the courtyard, her heart still pounding from the intensity of the questioning, she felt a strange mixture of relief and unease, aware that not everyone within the castle walls welcomed her presence with open arms. Bastian caught up with her near the courtyard entrance, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well," he said. "Better than many warriors twice your size would have managed." "I only spoke the truth," Elandra replied quietly. "Sometimes," Bastian said, "the truth is the hardest thing to speak clearly, especially before a room full of powerful people eager to find fault. You did well, Elandra." She offered a small, grateful smile, though her mind remained troubled by the sharp suspicion she had felt radiating from Corwin and Muriel throughout the meeting. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that her success with the royal cubs had placed her directly in the path of political tension, far beyond anything she had ever experienced in her quiet life as a kitchen maid. That evening, as she returned to the courtyard to continue her work with Kale and Roran, she found the cubs waiting eagerly near the stable wall, their earlier fear replaced entirely by joyful anticipation at her arrival. Kale bounded forward immediately, nudging playfully at her legs, while Roran approached more calmly, his vambrace still secure around his leg. Elandra knelt down to greet them both, grateful for the simple comfort of their presence after the tension of the council chamber. Whatever suspicion loomed within the castle walls, she found solace in the quiet trust of two small cubs who had come to see her not as a threat, but as a source of safety and calm. She did not yet know how deeply Ronan had begun to watch her, not merely as a solution to his son's fear, but as someone whose quiet strength had begun to stir something within him that he had long since buried beneath years of duty and hardened leadership. Nor did she know how much further the political tension within the castle would rise before the final trial of full armor arrived, testing not only her methods, but her place within the walls of Black Fang itself. Weeks passed, and the courtyard that had once echoed with growls and shouted warnings now carried a far gentler rhythm. Each morning, Elandra arrived to find Kale and Roran waiting near the stable wall, their earlier wildness replaced by an eager familiarity that surprised even the guards who had witnessed their earliest days of fear. The second vambrace had been fitted onto Kale without much resistance, his earlier stubbornness fading as he watched his brother wear the leather without complaint. Elandra had learned to read the subtle signs in each cub's behavior, understanding when to push gently forward and when to pause and let them simply enjoy her company without any expectation at all. She began introducing small games into their sessions, tossing soft leather balls for them to chase, rewarding calm behavior with quiet praise and occasional treats smuggled from the castle kitchens. The guards, once wary of approaching the cubs at all, now watched from a respectful distance, with genuine smiles, some even joining in playful moments when Elandra permitted it. One afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the courtyard, Elandra sat cross-legged on the stone ground, while Roran rested his head contentedly in her lap. Kale chased a leather ball nearby, his small tail wagging with pure joy, a stark contrast to the trembling, fearful creature he had been only weeks before. "You have done remarkable work," a voice said from behind her. Elandra turned to find Ronan standing nearby, his expression softer than she had grown accustomed to seeing during their earlier encounters. She began to rise, but he raised a hand gently, signaling that she need not stand on his account. "They are happy, my king," she said simply. "That is all I ever hoped to achieve." Ronan lowered himself onto a nearby stone bench, watching his sons play with an ease that had once seemed impossible. "I have ruled this kingdom for many years," he said quietly. "Through war, through loss, through more hardship than I care to remember. Yet I have never felt as helpless as I did, watching my own sons tremble in fear, unable to find a way to reach them." Elandra remained silent, sensing that the king needed space to speak without interruption, much the same way she had once given the cubs space to approach her on their own terms. "My own father believed strength could only be forged through fear," Ronan continued, his eyes distant as memories surfaced. "He armored me before I understood what war truly meant, forced obedience through discipline rather than trust. I swore I would raise my sons differently, yet somehow I found myself repeating the same mistakes, believing force was the only path toward readiness." "Fear can teach obedience, my king," Elandra said quietly, "but it cannot teach trust, and without trust, obedience often crumbles the moment fear disappears." Ronan turned to look at her, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "You speak with wisdom far beyond your years, Elandra. Where did you learn such things?" She hesitated, memories of her destroyed village flickering briefly in her mind, before she found the words to answer honestly. "I learned it the hard way, my king. I watched my village burn when I was young. I watched grown warriors freeze in fear, unable to protect the people they loved, while quiet acts of kindness often saved more lives than any show of strength. Fear breaks people, my king. Understanding rebuilds them." Ronan studied her closely, the weight of her words settling deeply within him. He thought of his own childhood, the harsh lessons forced upon him, the walls he had built around his heart in order to survive decades of war and loss. He had never spoken so openly with anyone since the death of his wife many years before, yet something about Elandra's quiet honesty made the words come easily, almost without his permission. "I am sorry," he said softly, "for what war has taken from you." "And I am sorry," Elandra replied gently, "for what it has taken from you as well, my king. I see the weight you carry, even if you try to hide it behind duty and command." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound in the courtyard, the joyful barking of Kale as he continued chasing his leather ball, unaware of the quiet transformation occurring between his father and the gentle Omega Maid who had reshaped their small family's world. Ronan rose slowly after a while, his usual composed strength returning, though something in his expression remained softer than before. "The full trial approaches soon," he said. "The chest plate and helm remain the greatest challenge. The War Council presentation will not wait much longer." "I understand, my king," Elandra said. "I will not rush them, but I will do everything within my ability to prepare them properly." Ronan nodded, lingering a moment longer than necessary before finally turning to walk back toward the castle. Elandra watched him go, her heart carrying a strange warmth she had not expected to feel, especially not for a king known throughout the land for his hardened resolve and unyielding strength. Over the following days, their brief encounters in the courtyard became more frequent, Ronan finding excuses to walk past during his busy schedule, pausing briefly to watch his sons grow steadier under Elandra's careful guidance. Their conversations remained brief, yet each exchange carried a quiet depth that neither fully understood nor dared to name. The castle staff began to notice the subtle change in their king's demeanor, whispers spreading quietly through the halls about the softened expression he wore whenever he returned from the courtyard. Bastian, ever observant, watched with quiet curiosity, wondering whether the growing bond between his king and the humble Omega Maid carried implications far beyond the simple matter of armored cubs. Elandra, for her part, tried to focus solely on her work with Kale and Roran, wary of reading too much into the king's occasional visits. She reminded herself of her place within the castle, a simple kitchen maid, elevated only temporarily due to an unusual set of circumstances. Yet despite her efforts, she found herself looking forward to Ronan's brief appearances more than she cared to admit, drawn by the quiet vulnerability he allowed her to witness beneath his hardened exterior. One evening, as she prepared to leave the courtyard after a particularly successful session with the cubs, Ronan appeared once more, his expression carrying a seriousness she had not seen before. "The council grows restless," he said quietly. "Corwin and Muriel continue to question your influence, despite the results you have achieved." Elandra's stomach tightened with unease. "Have I done something to cause further concern, my king?" "No," Ronan said firmly. "You have done nothing but succeed where others failed. Yet success alone does not silence those who fear change, especially change brought about by someone outside their expectations of rank and tradition. What must I do, my king?" Ronan studied her closely, his jaw tightening slightly. "Continue exactly as you have been. Let the results speak for themselves. The full trial will silence any remaining doubt, one way or another." Elandra nodded, though the weight of the coming trial settled heavily upon her shoulders. She understood now that her success was no longer simply about calming two frightened cubs, but had become entangled within the deeper political currents of the kingdom itself, currents she had never intended to navigate, yet found herself caught within nonetheless. As she walked back toward the servants' quarters that evening, she carried with her both the warmth of the growing bond she shared with the king and his sons, and the heavy uncertainty of the challenges still ahead, unaware of just how much would be tested in the days leading toward the final presentation before the War Council. The blacksmith arrived early one morning, carrying the newly finished chest plates carefully wrapped in soft cloth, his expression a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. He had worked tirelessly on the pieces, shaping the metal lighter and smoother than any previous attempt, hoping the reduced weight might ease the transition for the young cubs who had already come so far under Elandra's patient guidance. Elandra met him near the courtyard entrance, carefully unwrapping the chest plates to examine their craftsmanship. The metal gleamed softly in the morning light, far smaller and more delicate than the heavy armor typically forged for grown warriors, yet still an intimidating step forward from the simple leather vambraces the cubs had grown accustomed to wearing. "They are beautifully made," Elandra said, running her fingers gently along the smooth edges. "Thank you for your patience through all of this." The blacksmith nodded, his weathered face carrying a hopeful smile. "I have made armor for kings and warriors alike, but never have I hoped so deeply for a fitting to succeed. These little ones deserve protection, and it seems you may be the only one capable of giving it to them properly." Elandra carried the chest plates carefully into the courtyard, where Kale and Roran waited eagerly near the stable wall, their earlier fear now replaced almost entirely by curious excitement whenever she arrived carrying something new. She set the plates down gently, allowing the cubs to approach and sniff the unfamiliar metal at their own pace, exactly as she had done with every previous piece of armor. Roran, ever the more cautious of the two, circled the chest plate slowly, sniffing at its edges, before nudging it gently with his nose. Kale, bolder as always, pawed at the metal curiously, testing its weight before glancing up at Elandra as though seeking reassurance. "It is only metal," she said softly, her voice carrying the same calm reassurance she had used from their very first meeting. "It will not hurt you. It will only keep you safe." She allowed several long minutes to pass, letting the cubs grow familiar with the chest plates before attempting to lift them into place. When she finally moved to fit the armor onto Roran's back, she moved slowly, watching closely for any sign of the old fear resurfacing. Roran tensed slightly as the cool metal settled against his fur, his ears flattening for just a brief moment before he caught himself, remembering the trust he had built with Elandra over the past several weeks. He remained still, allowing her to fasten the straps carefully, his earlier trembling replaced by a steady, if cautious, patience. The courtyard, once again, fell into a hushed silence as guards and servants alike watched the fitting unfold. When Elandra finally stepped back, Roran stood quietly beneath the weight of his new chest plate, testing its balance with careful steps before settling into a comfortable stance, seemingly satisfied that the armor posed no threat. A soft cheer rippled through the small crowd gathered near the courtyard edges, quickly hushed as everyone remembered the sensitivity of the moment. Kale, watching his brother's success, approached the second chest plate with far less hesitation than Elandra had expected, seemingly eager to match his brother's newfound confidence. Within the hour, both cubs stood proudly wearing their chest plates, moving cautiously at first, before growing more comfortable with each passing minute. Elandra knelt before them, offering gentle praise and affection, her heart swelling with quiet pride at how far they had come since those first terrified days in the courtyard. Bastian arrived shortly after, his expression carrying open astonishment as he took in the sight of both cubs standing calmly in their armor. "I did not believe it possible," he admitted quietly, "not even after everything I have already witnessed." "There is still the helm," Elandra reminded him, though she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "The most difficult piece remains." "If you have succeeded this far," Bastian said, "I have little doubt you will succeed with that as well." News of the successful chestplate fitting spread quickly throughout the castle, reaching the War Council chamber before the sun had even reached its highest point. Even Corwin and Muriel, though still guarded in their skepticism, found it increasingly difficult to argue against results that continued to exceed every expectation set before them. That evening, Ronan arrived at the courtyard once more, his eyes immediately drawn to his sons standing proudly in their new armor, moving with far more confidence than he had ever imagined possible. He knelt down slowly, running his hand gently along the smooth metal now covering Roran's back, memories of his own childhood armor briefly resurfacing, before he pushed them aside. "They look ready," he said quietly, pride evident in his voice, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "They are almost ready, my king," Elandra corrected gently. "The helm remains the final challenge, and it will likely be the most difficult piece yet." Ronan nodded, understanding the weight of what still lay ahead. Helms had always proven the most difficult piece of armor for young cubs, restricting their vision and movement in ways that often triggered instinctive panic, even in cubs who had grown comfortable with every other piece of protective gear. "How do you intend to approach it?" he asked. "Slowly," Elandra said simply. "As I have approached everything else, I will not force it upon them. I will let them choose to wear it, in their own time, just as they chose everything else." Ronan studied her closely, something warm settling behind his tired eyes. "You have given my sons something I could not, despite every resource and authority available to me as king. You have given them trust." Elandra felt her cheeks warm slightly under his praise, though she quickly composed herself, unsure how to respond to such open vulnerability from a man usually so guarded in his emotions. "They gave themselves that trust, my king. I merely gave them the space to find it." Ronan remained a moment longer, watching his sons play together in their new armor, their earlier fear now replaced entirely by joyful confidence. He found himself unable to look away from Elandra as well, drawn by the quiet strength she carried so effortlessly, a strength forged not through war or command, but through patience and genuine understanding. As twilight settled over the courtyard once more, Ronan finally rose to leave, pausing briefly beside Elandra before speaking one final time. "The War Council presentation approaches quickly," he said. "Only a handful of days remain, before my sons must stand fully armored before the entire assembly." "I understand, my king," Elandra said. "We will be ready." "I believe you," Ronan said softly, before turning to walk back toward the castle, leaving Elandra standing quietly in the fading light, her heart carrying both quiet pride and the heavy weight of the challenge still awaiting her in the days ahead. The council chamber buzzed with restless energy the following afternoon, elders gathering once more around the long stone table, their voices low but sharp with renewed concern. Word of the successful chestplate fitting had reached every corner of the castle, yet rather than silencing the doubts held by certain members of the council, it seemed only to deepen the unease among those who valued tradition above all else. Corwin rose first, his weathered hands pressed flat against the table as he addressed the gathered assembly. "The girl continues to succeed," he said, his tone carrying grudging acknowledgement mixed with lingering suspicion. Yet success alone does not answer the deeper question troubling this council. What place does an untitled Omega hold within the royal household, now that she has become so deeply entwined with the heirs of Blackfang? Muriel nodded in agreement, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. The king visits the courtyard daily now, lingering far longer than matters of armor alone would require. Servants whisper of softened glances, of quiet conversations extending well beyond necessity. Such closeness between a king and an Omega maid raises questions this council cannot ignore. Bastian, seated near the head of the table, felt a flicker of unease at the direction the conversation had taken. The king's visits concern his sons, he said carefully. Nothing more. Are you certain of that, Bastian? Corwin pressed, his eyes narrowing. Or do you simply choose not to see what stands plainly before you? The chamber doors opened, before Bastian could respond, drawing every eye toward Ronan as he entered, his expression immediately hardening at the tension evident in the room. He took his seat at the head of the table, studying the gathered elders carefully before speaking. I understand this council continues to hold reservations, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. Speak plainly. What is it you truly fear? Corwin met the king's gaze directly, choosing his words with careful precision. We fear, my king, that personal attachment may be clouding judgment, better suited to matters of tradition and succession. The bond between yourself and the Omega Maid grows increasingly difficult to ignore. A heavy silence fell over the chamber, every elder watching closely for the king's reaction. Ronan's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained otherwise unreadable. My sons will stand before this council fully armored within days, he said finally. That achievement alone should silence any doubts regarding the maid's methods or intentions. And if it does not silence the doubts regarding your own intentions, my king? Muriel asked pointedly. The question hung heavily in the air, bold enough to draw sharp intakes of breath from several elders, unaccustomed to such direct challenge against their king. Ronan's eyes hardened, though he remained composed, understanding the delicate balance required to navigate both his personal feelings and the political weight of his position. My personal matters, he said slowly, are my own to govern. The success of my sons, and the safety of this kingdom, remain my primary concern. Nothing more need be discussed on the matter, unless further evidence of wrongdoing presents itself. Corwin bowed his head slightly, though his expression remained unconvinced. As you say, my king, we shall await the presentation, as promised. The meeting dissolved shortly after, though whispers continued long into the evening, spreading quickly through the castle halls despite Ronan's attempt to silence the matter. Elandra, unaware of the specific accusations raised against her, nonetheless felt the shift in atmosphere as she moved through the castle corridors, catching sideways glances and hushed conversations that quieted abruptly whenever she passed. That evening, as she sat quietly with the cubs in the courtyard, Bastian approached with a troubled expression, clearly carrying news he was reluctant to share. The council grows uneasy, he said finally, choosing his words with careful diplomacy. Not merely regarding your methods, Elandra, but regarding your closeness to the king himself. Elandra's stomach twisted with sudden anxiety. I have done nothing improper, Bastian. I swear it. I believe you, Bastian said gently. But belief alone will not silence political concern, especially among elders eager to protect old traditions against any perceived threat. Elandra lowered her gaze, memories of her humble beginnings surfacing sharply against the weight of the accusations now surrounding her. She had never intended to draw attention to herself, had only wished to help two frightened cubs find safety and comfort. The idea that her quiet efforts had somehow become entangled with questions of the king's personal conduct left her feeling suddenly vulnerable, exposed in ways she had never anticipated. What should I do? She asked quietly. Continue exactly as you have been, Bastian said firmly. Let your work speak for itself. The presentation will prove your worth beyond any doubt, regardless of whatever rumors circulate through these halls. Elandra nodded, though unease continued to settle heavily within her chest. She glanced toward Kale and Roran, resting peacefully nearby in their armor, unaware of the political storm brewing quietly around them. Whatever challenges awaited her in the coming days, she resolved to focus solely on ensuring their success, regardless of the personal cost such focus might eventually demand from her. Later that night, as she prepared for sleep within her small quarters, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it cautiously, to find Ronan standing outside, his expression carrying quiet concern beneath his usual composed strength. I heard what was said in the council chamber, Elandra admitted softly, unable to hide the worry evident in her voice. Ronan sighed, running a hand through his hair, in a rare moment of visible frustration. The council fears change, Elandra. They fear anything that threatens their understanding of tradition and rank. It has nothing to do with your worth, or the remarkable work you have done for my sons. Yet it affects you as well, my king, she said quietly. I would never wish to bring difficulty upon your reign. Ronan studied her closely, something soft and unguarded flickering behind his tired eyes. You have brought light into a household that has known too much darkness, Elandra. Whatever difficulty the council raises, I will handle it myself. You need only focus on preparing my sons for the presentation ahead. Elandra nodded, though the warmth in his words settled deeply within her chest, mixing uncertainly with the anxiety still lingering from the council's earlier accusations. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that the coming days would test not only the readiness of two young cubs, but the strength of bonds far more complicated and delicate than she had ever anticipated forming within the walls of Blackfang Castle. Sleep came slowly to Ronan that night, his mind restless with thoughts he had long avoided allowing himself to fully consider. He stood near the tall window of his private chamber, staring out over the moonlit courtyard where Elandra had spent countless hours patiently earning the trust of his sons. He thought of his late wife, gone many years now, and the loneliness he had carried quietly ever since, burying himself instead in duty and the endless demands of ruling a kingdom surrounded by conflict. He had convinced himself, for years, that such loneliness was simply the price of leadership, an unavoidable burden carried by any king determined to protect his people above all else. Yet since Elandra's arrival, he found himself reconsidering assumptions he had long accepted as unchangeable truths. He thought of her quiet strength, the calm patience she carried, despite the hardships of her own past, the gentle honesty with which she had spoken before the entire council, without flinching under their scrutiny. He thought of the way his sons had transformed under her care, not through force or command, but through simple trust, freely given and freely earned. He recognized, with quiet unease, that his growing feelings toward her extended far beyond simple gratitude for her success with his sons. Yet he also understood the political complexity such feelings carried, the resistance he would undoubtedly face from a council already suspicious of her influence within the castle. Elsewhere within the castle, Elandra lay awake as well, her mind equally restless with thoughts she struggled to fully untangle. She thought of Ronan's soft words earlier that evening, the quiet vulnerability he had allowed her to witness beneath his usual guarded strength. She reminded herself carefully of her humble position, an Omega Maid, elevated only temporarily through unusual circumstance, yet found herself unable to fully dismiss the warmth that had settled within her chest since their conversation. She rose early the next morning, determined to focus entirely on preparing Kale and Roran for the final and most difficult piece of armor still awaiting them. She understood the significance of the coming days, not only for the cubs themselves, but for her own uncertain place within the walls of Blackfang. The helm proved, exactly as expected, the greatest challenge yet. Unlike the chest plates or vambraces, the helm restricted vision and movement in ways that instinctively triggered panic in young cubs unaccustomed to such vulnerability. Elandra approached the challenge with the same careful patience she had used from the very beginning, introducing the helm slowly, allowing the cubs to sniff and explore its shape without any pressure to wear it immediately. Roran, in particular, struggled with the unfamiliar restriction, backing away nervously each time Elandra attempted to lift the helm near his head. She did not force the matter, choosing instead to set the helm aside and simply continue playing gently with him, until his earlier fear settled once more into calm familiarity. "It is all right," she murmured softly, stroking his fur gently. "We have time. There is no need to rush." Kale, watching his brother's hesitation, approached the helm with slightly more confidence, though even he flinched slightly when the leather lining brushed against his sensitive ears. Elandra remained patient throughout, understanding that pushing too quickly now, so close to the final presentation, risked undoing weeks of carefully built trust. Over the following days, she introduced small variations to ease the transition, cutting away portions of the leather lining to widen the cub's peripheral vision, adjusting the fit carefully to reduce the sense of restriction as much as possible, without sacrificing protection. She spent hours simply holding the helms near the cubs, allowing them to grow accustomed to their presence before ever attempting an actual fitting. Slowly, painstakingly, progress began to show. Roran allowed the helm to rest briefly against his head one afternoon, trembling slightly, but no longer pulling away in outright panic. Cale followed shortly after, tolerating the helm for a few brief seconds before shaking it off, panting slightly from the effort of overcoming his instinctive fear. Ronan visited the courtyard each evening during this period, watching quietly as Elandra worked tirelessly toward the final trial. He said little, understanding the delicate nature of the process, though his presence alone seemed to offer Elandra quiet reassurance during the increasingly difficult days leading toward the presentation. "They are struggling," Elandra admitted one evening, exhaustion evident in her voice, as she rubbed gently at her tired eyes. "The helm is proving far more difficult than I anticipated." "You have accomplished the impossible already," Ronan said gently. "Whatever challenges remain, I trust you will find a way through them, exactly as you have every step of the way." Elandra offered a tired smile, grateful for his quiet confidence despite the mounting pressure weighing heavily upon her shoulders. "Thank you, my king. I only hope I do not disappoint you, or your sons, when the presentation finally arrives." "You could never disappoint me, Elandra," Ronan said softly, the words carrying a weight far beyond simple encouragement. Their eyes met briefly, something unspoken passing quietly between them, before Ronan cleared his throat, seemingly startled by his own open vulnerability. "Rest well tonight," he said, his voice returning to its usual composed strength. "Tomorrow brings us one day closer to the presentation." Elandra nodded, watching him leave once more, her heart carrying a complicated mixture of exhaustion, determination, and a warmth she still struggled to fully name. As she gathered Cale and Roran close for the evening, preparing to return them to their quarters for rest, she allowed herself a quiet moment of hope, trusting that whatever challenges remained, patience and understanding would once again carry them through toward success. The following morning arrived with a heavy sense of urgency, only 2 days remaining before the cubs would need to stand fully armored before the entire war council. Elandra rose before dawn, determined to make whatever final progress remained possible before the fateful day finally arrived. The final day before the presentation arrived beneath a pale morning sky, the entire castle humming with quiet anticipation. Servants moved briskly through the corridors preparing the great hall. Guards polished their ceremonial armor, and whispers of the upcoming trial reached every corner of Blackfang, from the busy kitchens to the watchful chambers of the Pack Council. Elandra spent the early hours in the courtyard with Cale and Roran, determined to make whatever final progress remained possible before the cubs would need to face the full weight of their armor, before the assembled elders and visiting pack leaders. She approached the helms once more, her movements calm and steady despite the anxious flutter in her own chest. Roran, sensing the importance of the moment though unable to understand it fully, allowed the helm to rest against his head for several long seconds, trembling only slightly before settling into stillness. Elandra praised him softly, careful not to rush the process even now, understanding that patience remained the only path toward genuine success. Cale, watching his brother's progress, seemed determined to match his effort, allowing the helm to settle over his own head with only brief hesitation. Elandra held her breath, watching closely for any sign of panic, relieved when both cubs remained calm, testing the unfamiliar weight and restricted vision with cautious curiosity rather than outright fear. By midday, both cubs had tolerated wearing their complete armor, including the helms, for several continuous minutes at a time, walking carefully around the courtyard as they adjusted to the added weight and restricted sight. Guards and servants gathered quietly at the courtyard edges, watching in stunned admiration as the once untamable cubs moved calmly beneath the full weight of their protective gear. Bastian arrived shortly after, his expression carrying open astonishment as he observed the scene. "I did not believe such a thing possible," he admitted quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Not even after everything I witnessed these past weeks." "They have earned this," Elandra said softly, watching with quiet pride as Cale trotted confidently across the courtyard stones, his armor gleaming beneath the midday sun. Every piece of trust, freely given. News of the successful full fitting spread rapidly through the castle, reaching the War Council chamber within the hour. Even Corwin and Muriel, though still carrying lingering reservations regarding Elandra's closeness to the king, found themselves unable to argue against such undeniable success, standing plainly before them. That evening, Ronan arrived at the courtyard to witness the results himself, his breath catching slightly at the sight of his sons, standing proudly in their complete armor, moving with a calm confidence he had once believed entirely impossible. He knelt slowly before them, running his hands gently over the smooth metal now covering their small forms. "You have done it," he said quietly, his voice carrying open emotion he rarely allowed himself to display. "You have truly done it." "We have done it together, my king," Elandra corrected gently, though her heart swelled with quiet pride at the sight of Kale and Roran standing so confidently before their father. "They found their own courage. I merely gave them the space and patience to discover it." Ronan rose slowly, turning to face her directly, his expression carrying a warmth and vulnerability he had rarely shown so openly. "You have given my family something precious, Elandra. Something I feared had been lost long ago within these walls." Elandra felt her cheeks warm beneath his gaze, though she remained quietly composed, aware of the guards and servants still watching from the courtyard edges. "Tomorrow will be the true test, my king. The council and the visiting pack leaders will judge for themselves whether the cubs are truly ready." "They are ready," Ronan said firmly, "and so, I believe, are you." That night, sleep proved elusive for nearly everyone within the castle walls. Elandra lay awake in her small quarters, her mind cycling through every possible scenario that might unfold during the following day's presentation. She thought of Corwin's sharp skepticism, Muriel's pointed accusations, and the weight of expectation now resting so heavily upon two young cubs who had come so remarkably far in such a short amount of time. She also thought, more than she cared to admit, of the warmth in Ronan's eyes as he had knelt before his sons that evening, the open vulnerability he had allowed her to witness, despite the political dangers such closeness clearly invited. She reminded herself carefully of her humble position, yet found herself unable to fully silence the quiet hope stirring within her chest. Morning arrived swiftly, the great hall already filling with visiting pack leaders and elders from neighboring territories, their presence a clear reminder of the significance riding upon the day's presentation. Blackfang's strength and unity depended, in the eyes of many gathered within those walls, upon proof that its future heirs stood ready to carry forward the weight of leadership and protection. Elandra dressed the cubs carefully, within a private chamber near the great hall, her hands steady, despite the nervous energy coursing quietly beneath her calm exterior. She checked each strap and buckle with careful precision, ensuring every piece of armor rested comfortably and securely against their small frames. "You are ready," she whispered softly to both cubs, kneeling before them one final time. "Remember everything we have practiced. Remember that you are safe, and that you are strong." Roran nuzzled gently against her hand, his earlier fear replaced entirely by calm confidence, while Kale gave an eager, excited bark, clearly ready to demonstrate everything he had learned before the gathered assembly. Elandra rose slowly, taking one final steadying breath, before leading the cubs toward the heavy doors separating the private chamber from the great hall beyond, where the entire fate of the kingdom's future seemed to wait, breathless, for the moment of truth finally arriving before them. The great hall of Blackfang stood filled to capacity, torches lining the stone walls casting warm light across rows of gathered elders, visiting pack leaders, and curious servants who had quietly slipped in to witness the historic moment unfolding before them. Ronan sat upon his throne at the head of the hall, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes carried a quiet intensity as he awaited his son's arrival. Corwin and Muriel stood among the assembled elders, their expressions guarded, watching the heavy doors at the far end of the hall with sharp anticipation. Whispers rippled quietly through the crowd, some carrying hopeful excitement, others still tinged with lingering doubt regarding the unconventional methods that had brought them to this moment. The doors finally opened, and a hushed silence swept across the entire hall as Elandra stepped through, leading Kale and Roran calmly at her sides. Both cubs walked with steady confidence, their full armor gleaming beneath the torchlight, moving without hesitation, despite the restricted vision of their helms, and the added weight pressing against their small frames. Gasps of astonishment rippled through the gathered crowd as the cubs continued their steady walk toward the center of the hall, their earlier wildness completely replaced by calm, controlled composure. Even the most skeptical elders found themselves unable to hide their surprise at the transformation standing so plainly before them. Elandra guided the cubs to the center of the hall, kneeling briefly beside them as they came to a gentle stop before the throne. Kale sat obediently, his tail giving a small, excited wag, while Roran stood steady and proud, his earlier trembling nowhere to be found. Ronan rose slowly from his throne, descending the few steps toward his sons, his expression carrying open pride as he knelt before them, running his hands gently over their armored forms. "My sons," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "stand ready, fully armored, prepared to carry forward the strength and honor of Blackfang." A visiting pack leader from a neighboring territory stepped forward, his expression carrying grudging admiration despite his usual rivalry with Blackfang's ruling family. "I confess," he said, "I did not believe such control possible in cubs so young. Blackfang's future appears secure indeed." Murmurs of agreement spread quickly through the hall, the earlier tension and skepticism dissolving rapidly into open admiration and respect. Corwin, though still visibly cautious, found himself unable to argue against such undeniable success, standing directly before the entire assembly. Ronan rose slowly, turning to face Elandra, who remained quietly kneeling beside the cubs, her expression carrying humble relief rather than any desire for recognition. "This success belongs to her," Ronan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Where trained warriors failed, where tradition alone could not succeed, this Omega Maid found a path forward, through patience and genuine understanding." A quiet murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, many elders exchanging uncertain glances at such open acknowledgement from their king. Muriel, standing near the front of the assembly, studied Elandra closely, her earlier suspicions softening slightly beneath the undeniable evidence of success now standing plainly before her. "Rise, Elandra," Ronan said gently, extending his hand toward her. Elandra rose slowly, her cheeks warming beneath the weight of every gaze now fixed upon her. She had never expected such open recognition, had only hoped to help two frightened cubs find safety and comfort within their own home. Standing now before the entire war council and visiting pack leaders, she felt a strange mixture of humility and quiet pride swelling within her chest. Ronan turned to address the gathered assembly once more, his expression carrying quiet determination. "This kingdom has long valued strength forged through discipline and tradition," he said. "Yet today, we have witnessed strength forged through patience, understanding, and genuine trust. Blackfang would be wise to remember this lesson, not only in the raising of its heirs, but in every aspect of how we choose to lead." The hall remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling deeply among the gathered elders. Slowly, Bastion began to clap, the sound echoing softly through the hall, before spreading gradually among the assembly, growing steadily into genuine applause, honoring the remarkable achievement standing before them. Kale, sensing the celebratory shift in atmosphere, let out an excited bark, prancing proudly in his armor, as though fully aware of his own accomplishment. Roran, more reserved as always, simply pressed close against Elandra's side, his earlier fear now replaced entirely by quiet, confident trust. As the applause continued, Ronan turned once more to Elandra, his expression carrying open warmth despite the formal setting surrounding them. "Blackfang owes you a debt it cannot easily repay," he said quietly, his words meant only for her, amid the celebratory noise filling the hall. "You have given my sons safety, confidence, and trust, and you have reminded me of lessons I feared I had long forgotten." "It was an honor, my king," Elandra replied softly, her heart swelling with quiet emotion. "I only wished to help them find their own courage." "You have given this family far more than courage," Ronan said, his voice carrying a quiet tenderness that lingered warmly between them, despite the formal audience surrounding their exchange. "You have given us hope, and perhaps something even more precious than that." Their eyes met once more, something unspoken, yet deeply understood, passing quietly between them. A promise of possibilities neither had dared fully voice until this very moment. As the celebration continued around them, the gathered elders slowly setting aside their earlier doubts in favor of genuine admiration, Ronan extended a formal invitation for Elandra to remain permanently within the royal household, no longer as a simple kitchen maid, but as an honored guardian and companion to the young heirs of Blackfang. Elandra accepted quietly, her heart carrying a warmth she had never expected to find within these castle walls when she first arrived, weary and uncertain, only weeks before. As Kale and Roran pressed close against her sides, their armor gleaming proudly beneath the torchlight, and as Ronan watched with open affection, no longer hidden behind hardened resolve, Alondra understood that her quiet journey of patience and understanding had led her not only to the successful armoring of two remarkable cubs, but toward a new beginning entirely, one carrying the promise of belonging, purpose, and perhaps even love within the walls of a kingdom she now proudly called home.